We begin in Ottawa, where Conservative premiers are urging MPs to stop the upcoming carbon tax hike. In 4 days, the federal price on carbon will increase, as scheduled, from $65 per tonne to $80 a tonne. That means Canadians will pay about 3 cents more per litre on gasoline. Yesterday, Saskatchewan Premier brought his fight against the tax to a parliamentary committee. Today, New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith made their case. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith joins me now. Premier Smith, welcome back to the show.
Hi, David.
So you've made very clear you oppose the carbon tax, very clear you oppose the oil and gas emissions cap. So exactly what federal policies to reduce emissions would you support?
Well, we support working together on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We put forward our investment tax credit in our most recent budget. We're looking for some clarity around the federal tax credit. Also, the Strategic Investment Fund has been very supportive of several net zero projects that we have in our province for ammonia, for hydrogen, for petrochemicals, even for cement. So those are the kind of things we can work on together. You may have seen we just announced as well the first fueling station for hydrogen. We've purchased hydrogen vehicles. We're working with the federal government on hydrogen buses and dual fuel vehicles for transportation. So I would say that we have lots that we can work on together. It's just that, unfortunately, the federal government has set targets that we believe will result in production caps. And we also believe that they're unachievable. So we're still working through some of those.
Okay, the things you agree on and are working together on are helpful, but they're not going to get the whole job done. If you look at the international climate targets that Canada and other countries have agreed to. And if you look at the retail carbon tax, according to the analysis by the Climate Institute, that's 14% of emission reductions by 2030. The emissions cap on oil and gas is another 34% in emissions reductions by 2030. If Canada scraps those, that's nearly half of the emissions reductions that it has booked in its modeling. So how do you fill that gap? How do you replace that?
Well, I can tell you what I'm seeing is that in our Pathways group, which is our oil sands production, they're looking at carbon capture, utilization, storage for a part. They're looking at small modular nuclear for a part. They're looking at direct air capture as another piece. If you look as well at our electricity industry, they're looking at the same thing. And then there's also the incredible opportunity that we have to work through Article 6 of the Paris Accord to get emissions reductions internationally and get them credited back here. We know that Japan and South Korea and India would all like to do dual combustion with ammonia into their existing coal-fired stream to be able to reduce emissions. There's the replacement of coal with natural gas. All of those things are going to be able to allow us to reduce international emissions, which we could also get some offset credit for here. So I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to reach our targets.
Right, but this is half of what's booked right now. This is half of the plan. And so counting on Article 6, which a lot of people criticize as kind of magical thinking, because if India uses Canadian technology or Canadian resources to reduce its emissions, India is going to want credit. It's not going to cede that credit back to Canada, right? So like, how do we domestically deal with 50% of our emissions if you get rid of the retail carbon tax and don't go ahead with an oil and gas emissions cap? What is the plan to hit the target?
Well, I can tell you, like, even the environment minister has said that the carbon tax isn't going to have the effect that he's hoping for until 2060. And I guess that's really the question for the environment minister. I've mentioned 4 projects in Alberta that will be net zero as soon as they're completed. Major industrial projects. So we don't even have to wait until 2050 for those projects. But meanwhile, I'm trying to understand what he thinks he's doing by taxing individuals, taking a cut through the bureaucracy at the federal level, rebating a portion back. I mean, that's not going to cause people to take on zero emissions vehicles. It's not going to allow them to put solar panels on their roofs. It's not going to allow them to adopt a geothermal system in their homes. So there isn't really any connection between the carbon tax and the practical things that need to be done if you're going to reduce emissions. So I would question whether or not it's going to be successful at all.
Well, the modeling, though, attributes up to 14% of the reductions to carbon pricing, because people at the higher end of the economic ladder who are paying it and not necessarily getting the rebate that people at the bottom of the economic ladder are getting can make those choices and change their behavior because they have the means and thereby reduce their carbon hit. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's price signals through the market.
Well, look, I don't exist in a computer model. I exist in the real world. And in the real world, to get a net zero power grid in our province, we're going to have natural gas come on stream to be able to support increased adoption of solar and wind because it's a backup. That natural gas is going to have carbon capture, utilization, and storage at the very best available technology, which will keep on improving. We're going to see our citizens increasingly adopt zero emissions vehicles, whether it's electric in the big cities or whether it's hydrogen in heavy equipment and in rural areas. And we're also going to take the time to go through the regulatory process to adopt small modular nuclear, which I'm told will probably take until about 2035. In addition, we have funded a whole variety of projects on hydrogen, on bitumen beyond combustion, as well as on geothermal and direct air capture that I think will fill out the other piece. So I think I'm of the view that you need to make the technology available and the products available for consumers to be able to buy them. That has to come first. If you don't have those products available, then a carbon tax is just punitive. People are upset because they have an increase in the cost of everything they pay for and no real practical way to be able to transition to different fuels.
But Premier, we have this dynamic that's evolving right now. I mean, the political dynamic between the federal Conservatives and the federal Liberals is what it is. But on this debate about the future of climate policy in the country, we have politicians saying the carbon tax is too punitive, it doesn't reduce emissions, and it needs to go without presenting an alternative. And you have economists and environmentalists who have worked on this for decades saying it's the least costly way to deal with this, and here is the evidence that it is working, and there is no cheaper, as effective replacement. So why should Canadians believe politicians over people who have devoted their lives to working in this particular field?
Well, because I would just point to the fact that Dow Chemical is doing a $10 billion investment project with Linde that is world renowned. They've got 50 projects of taking hydrogen and being able to capture the CO2, and that is going to be in operation in 2028. I don't think that exists in any computer model. I don't think Interpipeline and their ammonia production, where they capture the CO2, put it underground, export it to Japan or South Korea so that they can reduce their carbon stream in their coal plants. I don't think that's in a computer model. And I don't think that the build out of our hydrogen economy, which is well underway in Alberta, we're one of the biggest producers of hydrogen, I don't think that's in the computer model either. So all I can tell you is what I see with my own eyes that are going to have an immediate impact on doing a massive reduction in emissions. And what I'm seeing with the carbon tax. With the carbon tax, we're giving $1 to Ottawa, they're giving us back 75 cents. With $400 every couple of months, that's just going to pay for the extra cost of everything. It's not doing any meaningful transition to reduce CO2 emissions. So it's a bit of a shell game. People see it, they don't like it, and they would like to see us invest in the technology to be able to achieve the outcome and deal with the very serious affordability crisis that we have in the immediate term.
Okay, on the affordability crisis, if you look at the math, though, that was done by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, I'm speaking strictly on the fiscal analysis of what you pay versus what you get in rebates. On a straight cash-in, cash-out analysis, roughly 80% of Canadians get back more than they pay in the carbon tax, and the net benefits for low-income Canadians is even higher still. It's significant there, and that's especially true in Alberta. It amounts to about a 3% boost in household income for low-income Albertans. So how is that not helping with the affordability crisis? Because if you get rid of the carbon tax, you get rid of the carbon rebate.
Well, it's got to be one or the other. I mean, is the tax there to cause people to make the investments that I talked about, which are multi-$1,000 investments, or is it there as some kind of income redistribution scheme? And if you're going to argue it's an income redistribution stream, then I guess I would have to argue that it doesn't go back to small businesses. The small businesses are they don't get the rebate. They just pay the tax, and then they have to work that into the price of all the goods that they have, and it gets passed on to customers. That's why the economic impact matters as well, is because you get a portion of it rebated to you, but then the price of everything you pay for ends up going up, which increases inflation. And when inflation goes up, then the Bank of Canada says, sorry, we can't cut your rates. And when your rates don't get cut, then when you go to renew your mortgage, that's also more expensive. So I think that they're creating a greater inflation crisis. It'd be so much easier if they just said, hey, look, we recognize oil prices are going higher again. This is a big cost. We'll take that entire 17 cents a liter off while oil prices are high because we know it's going to have an impact on you. That's what we did in Alberta. We gave $2.3 billion of relief over 2 years to do exactly that. And if the federal government wants to follow our model, that's what we do. When the rates are low, we end up having the tax back on. When the rates are high, we take them off so that we can give a bit of a break to people. And it works. Last year, we had the lowest level of inflation in the country. This year, with Scott Moe not collecting the carbon tax, he's got the lowest inflation rate in the country.
But the Bank of Canada,
example.
Premier, the Bank of Canada never cites carbon pricing as a reason for raising or holding rates. It's always international factors. It's always supply chain issues. It is increasingly provincial governments putting a lot of money into the pockets of their citizens and driving buying power. It's not carbon pricing. And Tiff Macklem has said that the direct effect of it is like 0.15%. The knock-on effect is 0.03%. We're talking 15 to 30 cents on $100. This is not the reason inflation and interest rates are high. It's a bunch of other factors, right? So isn't carbon pricing being kind of scapegoating here as the reason behind the inflation and affordability crisis when it's not the driving issue?
All I know is last January, when we had rebates for electricity, when we had rebates on fuel taxes, when we had our other affordability measures, we had the lowest inflation in the country. This year, with Scott Moe taking the fuel tax off of natural gas, he's got the lowest inflation rate in the country. So something else is going on there. Maybe the modeling is not taking into account all factors. I think it just stands to reason that when you have higher costs of energy, and energy goes into heating warehouses and transporting food and all of those additional costs for gasoline and diesel and heating, it's going to increase the cost of goods. It's just, I think it's fairly obvious to most people that the cost of living goes up when those kinds of costs go up.
Okay, well, I maybe, but that's not what the Bank of Canada is saying, and that's not what a lot of the economic modeling is saying, at least the role the carbon price is playing into this. But just as a final point, Premier, I mean, if you get what you want, I know on April 1, your gas tax is going back up because of a drop in oil prices. You need that revenue to help with your budget. That's going to stack on top of the carbon tax increase. If you get what you want and this goes away at the federal level, and if you get what you want and the emissions cap goes away, then everyone's kind of counting on industry to do this without sort of federal pressure and a price signal that compels them or creates incentive for them to act in a way or face financial penalty. Doesn't that just amount to Canada lowering its ambition when it comes to emissions reduction? Because the consensus among economists is that pricing is the best way to do it, and everything else, technology regulation, is more expensive, more intrusive, and not as effective as creating incentive for big polluters to change.
Well, I'll take a difference of approach with the retail carbon tax, which I don't feel consumers can avoid, and it just becomes an extra cost for them, versus industrial pricing, which we have done since 2007. And in fact, our TIER program, it's our technology innovation and emissions reduction approach. We put a price on industrial carbon. Those companies that are performing better than average get a credit, which they can sell on the market. Those that are performing worse than average have to pay into a fund. We've had them pay over $2 billion into that fund that go into emissions reduction technologies. And our program has been affirmed by the federal government to be equivalent to the approach that they wanted to take until 2030. So we're going to continue with that approach because we see that it's working, but we need it to be at the provincial level. We certainly don't want to see the federal government take it over, and that's why we're going to continue to fight against it. But industrial pricing is a different ball game, because those are the companies that do have the billions of dollars to invest in the technological change. But we shouldn't be hurting seniors, those on fixed income, those who are vulnerable, by having the price of everything they pay for continue to go up with these carbon taxes that they simply can't avoid.
Premier Danielle Smith, thanks again for your time today.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, as we just heard, there is opposition to the federal carbon price from premiers across the country.
We can all agree with party on we don't like the carbon tax.
I think it's creating a national unity crisis.
There's other ways of reducing emissions other than digging into people's pockets.
So far, 7 premiers have called on Ottawa to halt the planned April 1 increase. 3 of them have testified before a parliamentary committee, putting the federal government on the defensive over its signature climate policy. Jonathan Wilkinson is the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and he joins me now. Minister, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
Danielle Smith is one of 3 premiers who have testified at committee this week, with maybe more to come, pushing back against this April 1 carbon price increase. What's your reaction to what appears to be a concentrated effort to create pressure on your government to change course?
Well, I mean, look, it's obviously a pretty thinly veiled partisan effort on the part of Mr. Poilievre and a number of Conservative premiers. You know, this week was actually an important week, and it was an important week in part because of the letter that 200 economists from across the country came together to actually say, these are the experts on these issues, that carbon pricing is the least cost alternative to reduce carbon emissions. They are an important part of Canada's climate plan, and that the way in which it's structured is done in a manner where 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back, and in fact it's those that are most vulnerable that get the most money back. So we have a bunch of politicians who have zero background in these issues, and we have 200 economists who actually are experts in the field. I mean, at the end of the day, I put my weight with the 200 economists.
Okay, I take your point on that, and I have the letter in front of me, and I've read it, but we've seen from some of these economists who do support carbon pricing as the best and most effective way to do this, as you say. Also very unhappy with the carve-out for home heating oil that your government has done, and the fact that the policy, some of them object that it's not entirely just driven by pricing. There's a mix of regulations and other things there. But the criticism on the carve-out, they say you've undermined the value of carbon pricing and the argument that it is not an economic hardship for people at the bottom of the income ladder. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, certainly I have a lot of respect for a lot of the people that have written, in that letter. I obviously have a bit of a different view on the heating oil exemption, and it's not actually an exemption, it's a pause for a very specific period of time. It is very different from other ways in which you heat your home. It's 3 to 4 times as expensive as natural gas. It has escalated significantly in the last couple of years. It creates enormous affordability challenges for people who live on heating oil, most of whom, or many of whom, live in energy poverty. And so what we had said was, you can put in place heat pumps that actually will save people thousands of dollars a year, but most people who actually have heating oil as their source of heat in their homes can't afford to actually put that money up front. So we basically said we will pause it during the period in which we're actually implementing heat pumps so that within 3 years there will be an opportunity for people to actually save a ton of money. And so it is quite different from other forms of heating. At the end of the day, folks who actually heat with natural gas are getting more money back than they pay in the price associated with that. That wasn't true for people on home heating oil.
I was one of the people in St. John's who had an oil tank on their house. I've heated with oil, so I've paid the price firsthand, though certainly I've had good employment my whole life, so I wasn't at that lower end of the income ladder where you would have those struggles. But why not find a way to increase the rebates for people there so you keep the pricing system whole while you also work on the heat pump program? Because this carve-out, this pause, as you call it, it's being weaponized against your entire policy right now.
Well, as I say, I think the heating oil issue is a very specific issue. We have said that we've addressed affordability concerns generally with respect to the price on pollution, and that 8 out of 10 families get more money back, and that is just true. The data is true, and anybody who says that it's not true is lying to you. Like Pierre Poilievre is lying to Canadians, which is a very unbecoming thing for the leader of the official opposition to do. But that wasn't true with heating oil. It was a one significant exception, and at a time where people, and particularly people who are living on lower incomes, are struggling, what we said was we will pause the price, we will implement heat pumps, we will pay for the implementation such that you will then be able to actually save money on a go-forward basis. But it's a very different circumstance than everybody else who actually is getting more money back.
We spoke to the parliamentary budget officer last week on the day of the confidence vote on the April 1 carbon price increase to sort of get him to walk us through his findings that the Conservatives are using to say this carbon policy is hurting people, and which your government is using to say shows that people are actually getting more back than they pay in. And in some ways, both are true, right? On a pure financial cash out, cash in, 80% people get back more than they pay. But when you factor in the economic dampening caused by bringing in carbon pricing, economically, it does have an impact. Now, I know that doesn't assess the cost of climate change. It doesn't assess the alternatives to carbon pricing and the economic impacts they would have. How do Canadians walk through that, though, when you have one report with 2 different conclusions and a bunch of other contextual issues that are not factored into this analysis, but it's being boiled down to very simple explanations in the political arguments that are happening?
Well, this is the difficulty of politics in the modern age, where everything, often complicated issues, are sort of 30-second sound bites. But I would say to you, the one conclusion that is a full conclusion is that cash in, cash out, 8 out of 10 Canadians get more money back. That's just true. The other part of it, which is what is the effect on economic growth going forward? All the PBO did was assess the impact of the price on pollution. But as you've seen, including in the letter from The Economist, every other way to reduce carbon emissions is actually more expensive. So you would see that the numbers associated with the dampening are far higher if you did regulation or if you just did massive investment. And the other alternative is you just do nothing to fight climate change. And then you've got to actually look at what are the costs associated with just not doing anything about climate change. And those are going to be astronomical. So, I mean, the Conservative Party can mislead Canadians all they want, but the PBO's fundamental finding is that 8 out of 10 Canadians get more money back.
Well, when you look at where the mood has shifted, I don't know if Canadians feel the way they feel because of the affordability challenges caused by interest rates, inflation, the global effects on the food supply chain, which has driven up the price of groceries, or if they're believing the argument that you say is dishonest from the Conservatives, and certainly a lot of economists say it's dishonest from the Conservatives. But the mood has definitely shifted, Minister, right? I mean, how worried are you, as a guy who's worked on this and championed this for even before you got into politics, that just social license for this particular policy is, if not gone, it's significantly eroded and is very fragile at this point in time?
Well, I think that this is a conversation that we need to engage in a fulsome way with Canadians. At the end of the day, it is not sufficient for Pierre Poilievre and Conservative premiers to just complain. We need to be asking them, what is your alternative? What is your alternative to address climate change? And if the alternative on Poilievre's position is that he doesn't believe in climate change or he just isn't going to do anything about it, then he should be honest with Canadians about that. But right now, he is lying to Canadians about the facts. There are no facts that support what he is saying. And he has no plan to address the climate issue. His plan effectively is to let the planet burn for future generations. That's not responsible, and that's a conversation I'm happy to engage on a broad basis across this country. So
at committee today on dealing with questions about affordability for Canadians, the New Democrats have proposed this other option that I'm sure you're aware of, removing the GST, removing the HST in the blended jurisdictions from all home heating fuels to give people a break while cost of living numbers remain high, even as inflation decelerates. I know you want to stick with the purity of carbon pricing from this point on. Is that something you think the government will consider as a measure to help deal with pocketbook challenges for Canadians while preserving the integrity of your emissions reduction plan?
Well, certainly addressing affordability concerns are top of mind for the Government of Canada. We have been working to try to address some of the challenges that were caused by supply chain disruptions coming out of COVID and the inflation that we saw as a result of it. And of course, some of the interest rate issues that are now facing Canadians who have mortgages as we try to actually, Bank of Canada tries to temper inflation, which it has been doing quite successfully. And we've done that all the way along. I mean, the grocery rebate and the workers' benefit, but also programs like childcare, like what I was announcing today, building out affordable childcare. That will save, in Saskatchewan, where I am, I'm in Regina, it will save families $6,900 per year per child. Like, those are structural ways in which to address affordability. We are certainly going to continue to work on that. It is extremely important that we are addressing the concerns that are on the minds of Canadians who have gone through these challenges over the last couple of years. I will tell you, I was in Germany last week meeting with the Vice Chancellor, and I was previous to that in a number of other G7 countries. I mean, this is an issue in all of the G7 where people have come through some very challenging times, and governments need to be there to ensure that we are doing what we can to support them with affordability, and we are doing that.
Jonathan Wilkinson, Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, thanks for your time today, sir.
Thank you very much.
Okay, where are Canadians putting their weight on that one? Let's bring in the power panel. Cameron Ahmad is former head of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. And here with me in studio, Matthew Dubé is a former NDP MP. James, we've seen these arguments from the Conservative MPs, Conservative premiers. That is not a surprising thing. But the interesting development there from Canoe, his office, as the premier said a few times, that on home heating, Manitoba has a strong case to make to the federal government when it comes to removing the federal backstop. He seems to be getting ready to make some sort of a formal request. He's got a budget next week. What do you make of this development from the Premier of Manitoba?
And you will remember as well that in the province of British Columbia, the NDP government out here, or the NDP opposition at the time, and now NDP government, a lot of those now cabinet ministers, they were opposed to the carbon tax when it was brought in British Columbia as well. They've since adopted it, but I wouldn't be surprised if later in this year, an election year, where NDP numbers are softening in British Columbia, that they too may put something on the table in terms of something dealing with cost of living issues that may be reflected in their approach to carbon pricing. Christy Clark did that as well when she made it revenue neutral, and she capped it during her time as premier. So the public is sensitive, the public is angry, the public is worried about the cost of living. And I have to say, Minister Wilkinson, who I like a lot personally, he's an impressive person. If his communications after 8 years of pushing this policy is we have 200 experts on their side and they're just a bunch of politicians, I mean, that is the horrific communications, and that will doom this policy if it's not doomed already.
Well, he went much stronger than that. I don't know if you saw the whole interview. He flat out said Pierre Poilievre is lying about what he says about the carbon price, and he keeps coming back to the point that, and James, just get you to respond to this, all the premiers who are testifying this week saying we don't like this are not putting something specific on the table to replace those emissions reductions. And these are big chunks of the overall reductions plan. So, okay, if it's not the carbon tax, what is it? I mean, we're not hearing that from the opposers right now.
Well, I disagree, and I think Wab Kinew would disagree, and I would think the NDP in British Columbia would disagree when they opposed the carbon tax and had their approach to this that was quite different. And I think Bonnie Crombie in the province of Ontario, who's opposed to the government's carbon tax, would disagree as well.
There's no specific plans. It won't include this, but it's no specific example of we're going to do this. It's going to be cap and trade. We're going to no one's laid anything out just yet.
Well, in the one siloed area of climate policy, which is dealing with the price on pollution. But there are other aspects that deal with fighting climate change, that deal with technology, that would deal with global partnerships, that deal, with all kinds of global efforts to try to have carbon sinks. There are all kinds of efforts that go beyond on the single issue of having a price on carbon, yes or no. But that's not the only issue and the only element of dealing with the global fight and the need to do something significant and serious on a global basis with regard to fighting climate. I mean, it's one piece of it, but the idea that if you're not in favor of a carbon tax, you don't believe in the science of climate change is ludicrous.
No, I'm not saying that. Yes, I take your point on that. But Cameron, I want to pick up on something Kinew said there, that you've got to bring the middle class along. You got to bring people along. And that seems to be the problem right now with what's happening with the cost of living challenges across the country, that people have zeroed in on carbon pricing as the culprit, even though the Bank of Canada only says it's responsible for less than 1/20th of the inflationary pressures in Canada. The middle class is not coming along with the federal government on its current policy.
Well, absolutely. He's right. You do have to bring the middle class along. You have to bring working people along. And that's exactly why the government's price on carbon was designed to do that, by putting more money back in the pockets of the vast majority of people in this country or in the provinces where it's imposed. And I think one of the unfortunate things about this whole debate is that it's been really devoid of facts. So it's great to see the economists come out. It's great to see the experts come out. I would agree with James that it's not the most effective communications tool to be using as the reason why it's important, but it does matter. And in this debate, which is very wide ranging and has taken a lot of space in our country, in the media, in the conversation, it's important that we don't just give in to a fact-free narrative from the Conservative Party. It's easy for them to say, axe the tax. It's easy to lay out bumper sticker slogans. It's a lot harder to actually come up with real policy that's going to work. And we're still fairly far away from an election. So they're getting away with it. But enough is enough. And they need to bear some of the onus on explaining what they would do differently if they want to get rid of this policy. Because it's not the only thing. It's not the only policy that's going to bring our emissions down, but it plays a big part in it. It's actually a very significant contributor to getting our pollution down and meeting our targets. And what I really liked this week was seeing the Prime Minister and the Liberal team being a bit more aggressive in how they're going after Conservative premiers and, of course, the federal Conservatives by saying, where's your climate plan? What would you do differently? Do you even care about this issue? Because it's one thing to criticize, it's another thing to propose. And in 2024, in a G7 country, if you want to run this country when the whole world is taking this issue seriously, you have nothing to put forward. That is a vulnerability, and it's great to see the Prime Minister treat this issue more with an offense approach as opposed to a defensive one.
So Matthew, there have been two things this week that seem to support the government's argument, but only to some degree. There is the Climate Institute report that says retail carbon price is responsible for about 8 to 14% of the emissions reductions. And there is this letter signed by all the economists that the government and the Liberals are pointing to, but a lot of those signatories are saying, we're not supporting the government policy, we're supporting carbon pricing as a concept and as a principle. And they point to the home heating carve-out as something that has undermined the concept and the principle, and the fact that the system is really a hybrid system that combines carbon pricing with regulation and with technology and different things. So it's not quite the full-throated endorsement some Liberals would have people believe.
No, and I think that's the flip side of what I think Premier Canute did today, is he's not going after the federal government in this overblown way. In some ways, what he did today was more effective than the Conservative premiers who appeared before parliamentary committees, virtually, but here in Ottawa, which is to say that, saying exactly that hey, we need to do something about climate change, but what's the right mechanism? And I think we do a big disservice to experts in our politics, undermining their voices and their importance and making it look like elites versus everyone else. That being said, you do need public buy-in for these things. And I think the government has to start asking itself the question is, are they undermining overall and future efforts to fight climate change by focusing in this full-throated defense, to use that terminology, on this one policy when there's so many other things that need to be done? I think that's something they really have to start asking themselves. And it was interesting, and I don't want to put words in his mouth because maybe he intended a different message, but I heard the Premier of Manitoba say, we want to bring working people along. And what I think that means is it means having public buy-in, that you can't fight climate change without that support. Yeah. And so I think that's the big piece that's missing here from the government. And ultimately, the unfortunate old adage in politics is when you're explaining, you're losing. And if you need these big letters from economists, I think it speaks to, as James said, a big communications challenge. And I get it. It's more than just communications fighting climate change and developing policy, but you need the public buy-in or else you're not going to get very far.
Right, and Shachi, that's the challenge. I mean, James is right. You can tackle climate change without a consumer carbon price, but the consensus amongst economists is that if you focus more on regulations and technology and dictate sort of specific forms of technology, it can be more cumbersome, more economically damaging, and more costly and less effective over time. So there is a complexity to this, right? That needs to be discussed to deal with it properly, and it feels like that doesn't necessarily happen all the time.
This is a political fight that is not going to do well on issues of complexity and issues of, but what percentage of emissions reductions are affected by carbon pricing, or how many economists think that this is good economic policy. By the way, every economist I talk to also says it's good economic policy. That is not going to help the Liberals win this fight. This comes down to, and everything I am going to say, give me a bit of time here, is predicated on some data that we put out on Monday. The last time I was with all of you 2 weeks ago, I said, I worry the Prime Minister's losing the room. Well, now I can tell you the risk continues to be quite high, because the only people who are responding in a positive way to the Prime Minister's and the Liberal government's more aggressive take on this are those who are already inclined to be on that side of carbon pricing. What do I mean by that? You have seen an uptick in the number of Canadians who are actually saying, let's increase the carbon tax, let's increase that carbon price. But who are those folks? Those are NDP voters, those are Liberal voters, and those are Bloc voters. Here's the thing, that base, the size of that vote universe has shrunk relative to last year. So the people who were always in the room with you are more fired up about what they're hearing. The problem is the people who are slipping out the back door and no longer in the room with you, because what they are perceiving is the following. Number one, they still think the amount that they are receiving, if they are receiving a rebate, is less than what they're paying out. That perception is now in dangerous peril of being completely baked in. They are skeptical about whether or not this is an effective policy in terms of reducing emissions nationally and also globally. And when you put the question, because Canadians are not climate change deniers, some are, most are not. But when you put the question around priorities, and we see this in terms of top issue. We see it in the way that climate change is still a top 5 issue, but has declined in the number of Canadians saying it's a number 1 issue. When you say, hey, look, when it comes to your own personal priorities, what needs to come first? Affordability, even if it means a pause or a freeze or a hold on carbon pricing, or continue with a carbon price increase. It's worth it, even if it makes affordability tougher. People are going to choose, and they are choosing affordability over and over again at a majority level. This isn't about, for the government to come back and remind Canadians that they get a rebate is useful. To remind them that that rebate, for those who get one, is more than what they're putting in is useful. To say, well, the opposition's not coming up with any other ideas is not useful, because for Canadians, the pressure point is not the opposition has a better idea. The pressure point is they feel it's something that they can't afford. And what they need to hear from government is that that pain is acknowledged.
Well, right, and I think, James, we are starting to hear a bit of empathy on that point from the government of Canada. But going back to where you and I started with this, that you don't need carbon pricing, certainly for consumer carbon pricing, to have a climate plan. But we need to have that conversation now, don't we, of like what exactly that looks like. I know people talk about technology or in broad strokes, but not down to a level of specificity that we know exactly what it looks like. And can you hit the targets without consumers paying in some form or another?
I don't know, but consumer pricing on carbon is incredibly unpopular, which is why Wab Kinew and Pierre Poilievre would never be on the same platform on almost any other issue. But there they are, sharing the same microphone, talking about the same issue, and they're aligned. That's a broad that's a broad series of disagreements, but on this issue they have agreement. I think they both speak for voter universes that overlap, and that'll be beneficial to Pierre Poilievre in the long term. And again, I remember being on this program, many years ago, and liberals saying, look, we have a list of 200 economists and experts who say cutting the GST to 5% by Stephen Harper is terrible economics. It's awful public policy. Well, we did it, and then we're reelected, and then reelected into a majority, and then the Liberals got elected, and they kept the GST at 5%. So, this idea that, we have expert opinion and the public just better shut up and swallow is not going to work. And what it'll guarantee is that you're going to have Prime Minister Trudeau and Stephen Guilbeault in a convertible Cadillac like Thelma and Louise screaming towards the political cliff in the next campaign. This is all advantage to Pierre Poilievre and horrible communications and policy that they've already abandoned themselves in Atlantic Canada. So I appreciate Ahmad and Cameron, what he's saying about how it's good to see Liberals up off the ground and fighting back. It's great, and the only person who's cheering more for them to fight this fight is Pierre Poilievre.
Okay, but Cameron, I mean, on something as complex as climate science, don't we have to make space for experts in the conversation? I get it. We can't just point to the experts and say 100%, let's go there. You do need social license. You do need buy-in, and that is all fraying in the country right now because of a host of other factors. But there is this trend and impulse lately to just dismiss expertise, right? Very often in conversations about policy directions for countries.
Of course. I mean, it's a trend, and it's not the easiest way to talk about an issue. Certainly, using very catchy slogans and zeroing in on a policy and blaming the Prime Minister for every problem under the sun is really easy to do, especially when you're in opposition. And also when you're a premier who, despite bearing a lot of responsibility for fighting climate change, is choosing to do nothing about it or pretend that they're doing things that don't actually work. It was kind of astounding to hear some of the things that Scott Moe was saying on your program yesterday, and hearing, Danielle Smith say it's reckless, it's immoral, it's inhumane. What's reckless, immoral, and inhumane is to have no plan to fight climate change and not care about the climate crisis when your province is facing severe wildfires in the middle of winter. So I hear everything James is saying, and I agree on the point of, you're not going to win regular people over by just pointing to academics and economists, but I am saying it is important in this debate, in the broader debate that we're having, that the facts are actually front and center. And one of the reasons why this policy has become more unpopular and it's become harder for the government to communicate it, let's remember they won 3 elections on this policy, is because of the way that the Conservatives have zeroed in on it and very skillfully managed to evade answering any questions themselves about what they do differently, but also by just repeating things that are not true, calling it a cash grab, saying that it's responsible for all the inflation in the country, all the food inflation, that the government is pocketing the money, that families are not better off. Those things are not true. They've been disproven. So I'm not saying that the Liberals will win the argument by being very academic in the way they push back. They do have to be aggressive. They do have to fight back. They have to call out these mistruths. And the broader debate also has to be fact-based. And we cannot accept that every single debate in this country is cheapened by a really simplistic narrative.
Okay.
Careful about that argument about, we had 3 elections on this. The Prime Minister said, we've had 3 elections on this and we won all 3. Careful. You lost the popular vote in 2 of the 3. And if you actually look at the policies in Quebec and elsewhere, this was not a referendum on the issue in those 3 campaigns, and you lost 2 of the 3 in terms of how people voted. So careful.
Just really quickly, fair point, but the majority of people who voted for parties that support some form of putting a price on pollution or a system that would be similar.
What's changed, though? Okay, everybody's jumping in. What has changed is the fact that Canadians are not consistently identifying climate change as a priority at the same level and with the same level of urgency than they were in those last 3 elections. There is something else preoccupying them. We all know what it is. It's cost of living. We talk about that every week. And that's what's changed the political dynamics and what could change the campaign dynamics here. You can't look at the past and say, well, we won 3 times because people's minds were in different places 3 times from where they are today. That's it.
Okay, Matthew, because you didn't jump in, I'm going to give you a last word, and then we're going to change the topic. What are your final thoughts on this one?
No disrespect to James, but some ex-politicians are disciplined in jumping into the fray there. No, it's a challenge. I hear the point. I hear the point about experts, and I'm the first person to say we absolutely do diminish the role of experts in developing policy, but you need buy-in. And this is incredibly hypothetical, but you look at the Liberals spending all their time saying the Conservatives have no plan. If they lose to the Conservatives over fighting over this one issue, then doesn't that make climate worse off? That's kind of the irony here at the end of the day, is you do need to win elections. You need to convince the public if you truly think you have the better agenda. So there's the expertise and the policy piece, but there's the politics, and they go hand in hand.